Power has been lying to us from the very beginning.
Black history in America was a blatant lie. Not just distorted, not just incomplete, but deliberately rephrased. You were told your roots began in chains, that your ancestors were stolen from West Africa and brought to America as slaves. Period. End of story. But what if that's only part of the truth? Or worse, a carefully constructed myth? A banned DNA study, buried for years, uncovered something so explosive it threatened to expose the very foundation of American history. The results of this study is that Black Americans are not just descendants of Africans. The data pointed to something far deeper, far older, and far more powerful, a strong genetic presence in ancient Native American populations. And even more shocking, evidence that Black people were in the Americas long before Columbus ever set sail. So ask yourself, who buried this study? Why were its findings suppressed? And what are they so afraid of you discovering? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is genetic science, dismissed because it didn't fit the narrative. It challenges everything: textbooks, race categories, even land rights. Because if Black Americans didn't just arrive on slave ships, if they were already here, then the system we live under was built on more than slavery. It was built on erasure. And now the truth is rising back to the surface through DNA. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. And once you do, you'll never see your identity the same again. For generations, we've been fed the same watered-down version of Black American history, a version that starts abruptly in chains, sails across the Atlantic, and begins in 1619 with nothing but sorrow, captivity, and struggle. We're told that Black Americans are the descendants of enslaved Africans who were taken from West Africa, stripped of culture, and dropped into America's brutal plantation system. That's it. End of story. No past, no complexity, no deeper roots. But here's the problem. That narrative is not just incomplete. It was designed that way. It was crafted to erase everything that came before the boats. If our story starts in chains, then freedom looks like a gift, not a birthright. If our history begins with slavery, then identity becomes survival, not sovereignty. This mainstream version erases agency. It removes thousands of years of rich, complex cultural identity, both African and indigenous. It disconnects Black Americans from the land, from lost tribes, from spiritual roots that predate European arrival. And that's not an accident. History as we know it was written by the victors, the colonizers, the lawmakers, the textbooks. They didn't just conquer lands. They redefined people, reclassified entire populations, erased tribes, and renamed nations, and made sure Black Americans never fully knew who they were, only who they were told to be. But here's where things take a turn. In recent years, something powerful has been quietly challenging this whitewashed narrative. DNA, cold, hard biological evidence that doesn't lie, doesn't have bias, and doesn't need permission to speak. And what's revealing? It's not just shocking, it's revolutionary, because DNA is uncovering connections Black Americans were never supposed to know, and histories they were never meant to reclaim. So now we have to ask, what if Black Americans didn't just come from Africa, but were already here? What if the truth was buried, not in the ocean, but in our blood? And what if the biggest lie was that your story began in chains, when really it began with kings, nations, and untold power? Let's go deeper. What if your blood could speak? What if it could whisper the names of ancestors erased from history, and shout the truth that textbooks refuse to tell? That's the power of DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is the microscopic thread of life found in every cell of our bodies. It's the biological code that determines everything from your skin tone to your hair texture. But it also holds something far deeper: your ancestry, your story. And here's what they don't tell you: DNA doesn't lie, but the people who interpret it can. Now, let's break it down. There are two major types of genetic markers used to trace lineage. The Y chromosome, passed down only from father to son, follows your direct male line. It's like a torch carried through the generations, unchanged, unbroken. Then there's mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, passed from mother to child. It traces your maternal line all the way back to your earliest grandmothers. Together, these markers form a genetic breadcrumb trail, one that scientists use to map migrations, build family trees, and unlock the truth of who we are and where we come from. But here's the catch. When these trails lead to places that disrupt the official narrative, like evidence that black people were present in the Americas long before Columbus, the trail suddenly goes cold, studies vanish, researchers are discredited, and funding disappears. Why? Because DNA doesn't just tell stories, it threatens systems. In the early 2000s, multiple DNA studies found genetic markers in Native American remains that pointed not just to Asia, but to ancient African lineages, long before the transatlantic slave trade. Some of these results were labeled contamination. Others were buried in obscure journals, never reaching the public. A few brave scientists who tried to publish these results found their careers stalled, silenced, or ignored. But the suppression was even deeper. Take the story of Henrietta Lacks, a black woman whose cells were taken without consent in 1951 and used to create the first immortal human cell line. Her DNA helped power medical breakthroughs, vaccines, gene mapping, and cancer treatments. But her family never gave permission. Her genetic code was literally harvested, commodified, and distributed globally, all while her descendants remained in poverty. If even her DNA could be exploited without consent, what makes us think modern DNA research is immune to bias or control? See, DNA is not just about genes. It's about truth. It's about reclaiming stolen names, erased nations, and forgotten civilizations. And when the truth doesn't fit the system rewrites the script. But not anymore, because black Americans are turning to DNA not just to learn, but to unlearn, to challenge every lie they've been fed, to reconnect with a legacy that is bigger, older, and richer than slavery could ever define. And trust me, what DNA revealed will shape the foundation of everything we thought we knew. Imagine spending your entire life being told who you are, only to find out that the people who told you never really knew, or worse, never wanted you to know. That's what many black Americans are now realizing, thanks to DNA research that wasn't just controversial, it was buried. Let's start with one of the biggest players in the historical narrative, the Smithsonian Institution. For over a century, it shaped how Americans saw themselves and how black history was told. But behind closed doors, their scientific research began to reveal something they couldn't explain or refuse to acknowledge. In the early 2000s, the Smithsonian launched extensive DNA testing and archaeological reviews of ancient remains found in North and South America. These weren't recent skeletons. Many were thousands of years old. But here's where things got strange. Some of these remains contained haplogroups commonly found in sub-Saharan African populations, markers that, according to mainstream history, shouldn't have been there. These were pre-Columbian remains. That means before Columbus, before slavery, before any so-called African migration. What were West African genetic markers doing in ancient American burial sites? Instead of publishing these findings with transparency, internal reports were shelved, certain researchers were pushed out, and the data quietly disappeared from the spotlight. Some called it academic caution, others call it historical erasure, but that's not the only case. Let's go back even further to a man who dared to say what Western scholars wouldn't. Cheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese historian, physicist, and anthropologist. In the 1960s and 70s, Diop began conducting bold biological tests on the skulls and skin tissue of ancient Egyptian mummies. He wasn't just trying to prove they were African. He proved they had melanin, wide nasal indexes, and cranial structures consistent with modern black populations.
I'd like to give credit to Black Culture Unlocked. One of the things that we have to deal with is truth.